This is section 4.2, practice A. For number 1, we're going to copy the congruent triangle shown at the right, then label the vertices of the triangles. So the triangle CPN is congruent to triangle BIY. Identify all pairs of congruent corresponding angles and corresponding sides. So it really doesn't matter where you put the three letters CPN. But since triangle CPN is congruent to triangle BIY, you need to mark that as such over here. So for example, angle C, we want it to be congruent to angle B. So I'm just going to say that's angle B. Angle P, notice I'm using two arcs because that's not necessarily the same as these angles. Angle P needs to be congruent to angle I. So make sure you have matching arcs there. Angle N needs to be congruent to angle Y. Now, those are three pairs of congruent angles marked, and that's probably the easiest way to do it when they just give you the three vertices for each of the triangles. Now, you also need to mark the congruent sides. So, for example, segment CP, use your diagram or your statement here, segment CP goes with segment BI. Segment PN goes with segment IY. Segment CN goes with segment BY. Here's a different section. Here's two triangles. They're telling you that triangle EFG is congruent to triangle OPQ. So these triangles are congruent. That means you know 6 things, okay? And they're going to ask you about, well, 6 things. So that works out. What is segment EF congruent to? If you use the picture, there's a possibility that you might get confused if this wasn't a translation. Use the statement. It's better. It's more efficient. It's safer. Segment EF is congruent to segment OP. Angle P is congruent to angle F. Angle G is congruent to angle Q. The measure of angle O. Okay, so when they ask you for a measure, you need a number. Well, I know that angle E is 110 degrees. Isn't angle E congruent to angle O? So angle O's measure is going to be 110 degrees as well. This is also asking you for a measure. How far is it from Q to O? Right? Well, here's Q, here's O. How far is this? Well, Q to O is the same thing as G to E, which we know is 7 kilometers over here. So this is also 7 kilometers. Triangle GFE is congruent to one of these triangles, the other triangle over here. They basically just want you to line up the parts. What does G go with? Use your statement. G goes with Q. What does F go with? P. What does E go with? O. Write a congruent statement for any figures that can be proved congruent and explain your reasoning. When they ask you for a congruent statement, they're talking about this. This triangle is congruent to that triangle. Can you tell that? Well, we only have one way to tell if two triangles are congruent, and that's if you have 6 pairs of congruent parts that correspond. We have a pair of congruent angles, a second pair of congruent angles, a third pair of congruent angles. We have one pair of congruent sides, 2 pairs of congruent sides, 3 pairs of congruent sides. That's your 6 things. These triangles are congruent, and that's by the definition of congruent triangles. Let's just call this triangle IGE. That order doesn't matter, but the order that you line it up with does matter because I can only go with angle O. G goes with angle M, and E goes with angle Q. Do you have enough information to say that these two triangles are congruent? Well, we have one pair of congruent angles. That's not enough. That doesn't mean they're not congruent. It just means we can't say right now that they are congruent. Here's number 10. We got a pair of congruent angles. We got a second pair of congruent angles. We got a third pair of congruent angles. We got congruent sides. That's one pair. Congruent sides, another pair. And reflexive property tells us we have 3 pairs of congruent sides. These triangles are congruent by definition of congruent triangles. Let's name the triangles. I'm going to call the top one triangle KLN. So this bottom one is going to be triangle MNL. Notice how N doesn't go with N and L doesn't go with L. Be careful there. See how L has 1 arc here, but 2 arcs there? That's why. Number 11. We got a pair of congruent sides, second pair of congruent sides, third pair of congruent sides. We got a pair of congruent angles. We got a second pair of congruent angles. Do we know if these angles are congruent? Yeah, they're vertical. So that's our third pair of congruent angles. So again, these triangles are congruent by definition of congruent triangles. Let's just write the congruent statement. So we'll call this triangle DEG, and that's going to be congruent to triangle HEF.